And so this talk won't be about code, but about communication and effective tools to do that within your team that hopefully prevent us from rewriting code, which everybody likes to write less code rather than more. So, so what's the problem? You know, Vui kind of summarized it there, but a lot of times we start off a project and requirements and designs have most of what we need in order to do our job. And often it's that happy path of, you know, I press a button and something happens right away and it does the right thing. I move on to the next screen. But there's a lot of things that sometimes can get left out, and things like how do you deal with network delays or alternate paths through the app or canceling or error handling. And so, you know, we will start writing our code. And as we go, we're like, oh, what happens here? You know, this API might give us, you know, some error code I didn't expect. And then you have to go back and talk to your designers and your product managers and say, hey, we've got this other thing. How do we handle it? Or somebody might show up and say, hey, why aren't you done yet? You said you would be done now. It's like, well, now you have to go into this explanation of things that you didn't foresee when you started. And this happens all the time for a lot of reasons, but you don't want to get into a situation where your schedule is slipping dramatically, people are working extra hours, and just in general being unhappy. And so, you know, what's my experience with this? You know, I'd worked on a very large app and we were implementing a really complex new feature. And the designs that we got pretty much focused on that happy path. There was some error handling that was specified in the requirements and a few designs for that, but not a lot. And a lot of missing waiting states of what happens when you're waiting for some web API to get back to you with a response. And some of our backend API docs were incomplete. And so when we met as a team and said, okay, you know, here's what we're going to build, and let's have some discussions and meetings about it. A lot of decisions were made, but they weren't written down. Things weren't updated. And there was no one place where all of that information from API docs and specifications and designs really all came together and was integrated in kind of a succinct way so that people could look at it and say, yes, I've got this big picture and I understand how all the pieces fit together. And now I can go off and do my detailed work. And so when you do that, you know, without that big picture, it's hard to kind of ask questions and see what's missing. And so, you know, how it went. Because we didn't have those, our schedule slipped by a lot. And there was a lot of rework of code, designs changed, specs changed, lots of feature creep, and a lot of unhappy people because, you know, we were working extra hours. We were really under the gun from a lot of different, you know, different factors. And it, you know, it took its toll on the team. And so we don't want to be here. And so how do we get ourselves out of that? How do we help ourselves to be in a better place? So, you know, you probably heard the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but what does that really mean? So I could describe in excruciating detail everything about some famous painting, or I could just show you. And, you know, when you see the Mona Lisa in front of you, all of the detail of that and the nuance and everything, you can start to see it the more you look at it. And now you have some context as to the entire artwork. And if you're discussing this with somebody else and asking questions, oh, you know, isn't it kind of creepy how her eyes follow you everywhere you go? You know, why is that? Or, oh, look at the shadows and and whatever, on her garments, and how did he paint that, whatnot. And when you have this overall picture, then things like all of these detailed descriptions and whatnot start to kind of fill in the gaps, but you all have a common reference to start with. And so, what does this mean for our code? What about our code? Usually this is kind of where we start. We have some wireframes of a lot of screens. We have some, documentation specifications, and some web API stuff maybe, or SDK docs, and then some sample code, or code we've started to write to do some prototyping. But notice there's really nothing that is bringing all that together. And what can we do about that? And I'm going to skip one slide because I didn't paste something in, and talk about a tool we can use to really bring all of those things together and communicate and get everyone on the same page. And so what I'm calling interaction diagrams is just a diagram that lets you capture all of your critical functionality of your app in one picture. And it gives you a tool to start to communicate between your team about complexities, and your designers are wanting to express something. Maybe your backend team has a bunch of API details they need to get in front of people. You've got concerns about the code. You want to be able to put that together so that you can see where their things are missing, and start to fill in those blanks and work together. And and an interaction diagram, it doesn't replace all those other documents, but what it does is it supplements them, and it ties everything together in a succinct way. And with the goal of, once you have this document and you're using it to communicate, you're doing these things in a kind of a proactive way, that's going to help prevent you rewriting code that you would have gone off and charged in and discovered these holes later. And so when you build an interaction diagram, what do you want to do? You want to capture all of this screens in your app, but at a very low fidelity. You're not trying to repeat what your designers did. You're just trying to say, I've got this screen. How do I navigate to the next one? How do I go back or cancel? Where are all my asynchronous operations, like API calls or some long-running SDK operation? And how do I show that those things are happening, and then handle errors? And so the bulk of this talk is not to just introduce the concepts, but show how you can put them into practice and give you a series of steps so that you can make use of this in your own development. And so getting started. There's a lot of different drawing tools out there. What I find the easiest when I am approaching some new work is just get out a sheet of paper and some pens and markers and things and start drawing. There's a lot of good iPad apps out there, as well as some online block diagram applications. Let's see, Miro.diagrams.net, Lucidchart. There's a whole bunch of different ones, and I can maybe give some suggestions later. The other thing is using color in your diagrams, like I mentioned, markers and things like that. That helps really distinguish between your different types of views, and so that's kind of a valuable thing when you're drawing, and we'll see that as I go through. And I really do find that first pass is best done on paper, because you can sketch things out really quickly and then transfer it into an electronic format. And probably one of the most important things is you need to be able to share these diagrams. You want to use this as a tool to communicate between members of your team. And you need to be able to have everyone either edit or make suggestions on that document, so that you can capture everybody's concerns. And it is a living document, but it's hard to keep documentation up to date. I think we've all been there, in that we're all human. But the nice thing about being able to share these documents and have other people edit them is that you don't have to do it all yourself. You know, you're working in a team. Everybody should be able to contribute and build this and keep it as up to date as you need for your team. So step one, first thing to really do is, get familiar with all your documentation, but then look at your design, look at the UI designs, and just capture all the screens, and just simple boxes and lines between each step. If you press a button to go to the next screen, draw a little rectangle on there for a button, and draw an arrow from it. And so this is my first pass at the example for today. And it's a simple, common kind of login flow that we see in a lot of apps. And, you have your onboarding and then maybe a screen that says, oh, do you want to log in or do you want to sign up? And maybe that takes you to a sign in screen. You enter your username and password. And when you're done, you go into the app, or you go into entering your user information and maybe your address and some payment information, and you get to the end and you're ready to go. And it's like, okay, we know we're going to hit some endpoints and do some validation. So you've got little clouds in there to kind of capture that. Maybe there's some error conditions, but usually what that first pass is going to be, and I can't highlight things with my cursor here, is just those boxes.
Steve,
Yeah.
Is it okay to answer some questions before you move on?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Let's see. So Navati asked about, would love some recommendations on drawing tools for the iPad. I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, and I guess Abby and Sam wrote some recommendations on paper for iPad, Miro. And
Yeah.
also another question is, any tips on how to keep docs up to date?
Okay. Yeah, sure. So as far as iPad drawing apps, I've used paper for a long time and I'm really happy with it. And it fits my needs pretty well. Paper, the iPad app. And the one thing I've noticed with that is there's a certain level of complexity that I can't quite capture sometimes. And so I've started projects where I use actual, pencil and paper and markers and things. But I've also done it on the iPad using the paper app. And I felt like for very simple things, the paper app works pretty well. But I start to need to like tweak little things and paste in details and stuff. And that for me works better using an online drawing tool like Lucidchart or diagrams.net. There's a few others. So really, in the end, whatever works best for you is the tool you should use for you and your team, because you do need to share these things. And so some tool that has the collaborative online editing is pretty much a must. So we can talk a little bit more about tools maybe at the end, about suggestions, and maybe some other people have suggestions from their experience as well. And then there was another question. Sorry, Louis.
Yeah, like what any advice you have for being able to keep the documents up to date?
Yeah, and I will talk about that later in the talk because I've got something in there for that. So Okay, so let's go to the next step here. So I took this messy piece of paper with my bad handwriting, and this is probably the first thing you'll capture is a bunch of boxes representing each of your screens and arrows between them. The absolute most naive happy path you can draw. And what's important is now you have something down in an electronic format that you can share. And that's the first step. So where do we go from there? And what I want to do with all of these steps is build on things in kind of easy to do steps, and what's the next simplest thing to do to get you moving and get things captured quickly. So one of those next steps is capturing your back behavior. So almost every iOS or Android app or web app, you can go back or you can cancel out of the screen. And it's really important to explicitly capture those things on your diagram. We often make a lot of assumptions of, oh, it's just going to go back to the previous screen. But what if your previous screen was some interstitial screen that shows up in between steps? You might not go back to that screen. You might go back 2 screens or 3 screens. And you want to make sure that you capture every single navigation path you can, because you're going to be writing the code for this and you want to get it right, hopefully the first time. And this is one of those things that in my experience I've found is often not documented in the designs. And so this is really a good time to go and talk with your designers and the product teams and say, okay, where do we go when I hit cancel? Do I go back to the beginning, or do I go out of this feature totally and back somewhere else in the app? And have that conversation early on, and just make sure that that's in your drawing. And so I realize this is kind of messy, but now you've got some extra arrows in here for not just the forward path, but what happens when you go back, what happens when you cancel. And if you cancel out of that address entry or payment information screen, that takes you right back to the start of the sign in and sign up screen. Any questions so far? I've not got my chat up, so Louis, feel free to ping me if you want me to pause.
Yeah, so far most of the questions were about the diagramming tools.
Okay.
Which I know we'll go over some more later, so I think we're good.
Okay, great. So so next thing to capture, asynchronous operations, web APIs, maybe long-running calculations or requests for on-device services that take some time. You want to make sure you capture all of those. These are some of the things that non-developers often leave out, because sometimes there's an assumption or maybe some inexperience that things just happen instantaneously. And we know most of the time they don't. And so you want to catch those things and put them on your diagrams. And this is a very important thing that I've found is kind of a source of delays, of communication problems as to the complexity of what you're doing in code, in talking back with other non-developer members of your team. And so that first step is capturing these async things and what's the happy path. And so in our example, let's say you already have an account, and so you do your sign in and you hit the login button and it takes you to some, well, it doesn't take you to, it hits some API, web API endpoint, some login endpoint, and you wait for the response. And when you're done, it takes you into the app. Or when you're doing your sign up, you might validate the user's name and email and a password. And when you're done with that, it takes you to the address entry screen. And maybe from there, you're hitting the US Postal Service's address information endpoint to say, is this a valid address or does it need to be reformatted? And then from there, you enter your payment information and maybe it hits Stripe or some other payment processor to validate your credit card info. And so, now we're capturing all of those asynchronous operations and kind of the best possible case of everything's okay. And we move on to the next screen. And then that next step of, these are asynchronous, they don't happen right away. We need to have ways to indicate to the user that they need to wait, that something's happening. And so capturing those is really important. Your designer may have a preference for how they do that within the app. Your product teams may say, hey, you know what, this is a time to show some screen to educate them about some part of the process of how you use the app. And so there's a lot of different options you can use there, and modals or an on-screen spinner that's embedded with your UI, or something inside the button, or just a full screen wait screen that gets pushed. And so you want to capture those as well. And this is kind of simplistic, but these purple boxes are, let's just call them modals, and really you'll develop your own style. It's good to maybe have a key or a legend on your document to say what the colors mean or what the shapes mean. But let's say in the login case, or validating, or checking the address, that we just pop up a modal that says please wait, and there's a spinner there. And then we can look back at the design documents and we'll see how we need to format that and whatnot. But we do something different for the credit card payment. We're going to push this full screen wait screen that says verifying your payment, please wait, and it has some animations of dollars spinning around or something. And so there we're going to indicate something slightly different. And probably one of the biggest sources of complexity in a lot of our designs is how we do error handling. Anytime you hit some external service, or using some internal SDK that's asynchronous, there's likely going to be something other than the success response. And you'll have some error conditions you need to deal with. Sometimes they'll just silently get absorbed, but most of the time you're going to need to tell the user about it. And so as you are looking at API docs, or you're looking at the SDKs you're going to use, you need to be aware of all the different ways that things can go wrong. And so if your designs and if your spec don't already capture this stuff, this is a really important thing to discuss with the rest of your team. How are we going to indicate these things to the user? What are their options when it comes up? Are you going to retry things, or you cancel out, et cetera? And how do you want to present it? And so this is not complete. There are lots and lots of error cases that I could throw in here, but just as an example, I said, okay, we submit our payment information to have our credit card validated. What can happen? You might have a response, and I've totally made up numbers here, so don't go look at the Stripe API and call me out on anything. But you may have a response that says, hey, your credit card info is invalid. It's just not right. Or You might have one that says it's expired, but it's a different response. Or you have all the other generic classes of errors, a 404 or some 500 or 501 that the server is just not available. You may have a generic bucket for all of those, some generic error. So you need to make sure that any possible error condition that comes back from your async operations, that you do your best to capture all of those. And then maybe have a default catch-all that if it's not any of these responses, it's something you don't know about, you're going to have to handle that as well. And then, you present this error alert and there's a button there. What happens when you press the button? And in our case, it's just taking us back to the payment screen to maybe edit or back up or cancel out. And given that, we're doing these async operations, and some APIs, some web APIs that you talk to may take 60 seconds for them to time out. So your user could be sitting there for a long time thinking, is anything happening? Did the app break? What's going on here? I need to go pick up my kids. And you want to present the opportunity for the user to cancel those operations if possible. And so another thing to discuss with the rest of your team, and to figure out what your options are and how you're going to do that. And if you do cancel one of these operations, where do you go and what do you do? What do you show the user? In this case, I'm not really capturing any cancel on the error paths, but one thing that's in here is hard to see is the ability to retry. And so when you do get an error, if all is not lost, you want to allow the user a way to retry. Oh, my Wi-Fi was down, or I was, I had my cell service was off or something. And so, that ability to retry, the ability to cancel these long-running operations are all really important. And then all of this kind of leads to, how do you keep these diagrams up to date? One of the things I like to do is, instead of going right from this document and seeing some holes and say, oh, what do we do here? I'll ask somebody in Slack. Write those things in the document explicitly, and use big bold letters and color and whatever gets somebody's attention to say, hey, don't we get error codes back from our login thing if the username and password are bad? Because I can't find that in the docs anywhere. Put all of those things down, on paper in your document, so that you now have kind of a forcing function. You now have some impetus to get those questions answered. And every time you look at the document, those open questions are in front of you and in front of, all the team that looks at this. And then that helps you to say, oh, yeah, we do have some error codes there. And you know what, we need to update our documentation. And then you can go back and say, okay, I know how to capture this in code. Let's figure out how to handle those error cases in here. And so that gives you a way to start that conversation of keeping things up to date and getting answers. And then you don't want to leave these big red, bolded text in there. You want to be able to take those out and fill in the blanks. And that I found that good presentations, good visualization of your systems and of your architecture, what that allows you to do, what it allows other people to do, is ask questions. and to look at things and see, hey, you know what? I don't think we want to do this way, or, you know, why are we doing this way? What do we do in this case that doesn't seem to be, you know, here on the diagram? All of those things get people engaged to be answering questions, and gives you kind of the motivation to keep updating your diagrams. And like I said before, we're all human. I am guilty as everybody else about not keeping things up to date. And it's hard, you know, once you're starting coding, you're focused on that, and that's what you want to be doing. You're cranking things out. And it's hard to pull yourself away and go back and you know, type up some things or move some boxes around. But you know, don't fret if it's not perfect, because it's not going to be pretty. It's never going to be perfect, but at least you want to capture as much as you can. You want to use this as a tool. And if you're sharing it, you're not the only one on the team. Other people can keep things up to date as well. And it's important to be able to delegate and to ask for help and say, hey, you know what? I know we made this decision. I'm busy now. Can you update the document for me and fill in the answers that we got in that meeting or whatever? You know, don't take all that load on yourself, because you'll never get everything done.
We have another question, if
Sure.
now's a good time.
Yeah.
So Navati is asking, what if you have some logic around one of the arrows? For example, retry
Yeah.
has logic, or rather threshold to be tried twice only. Do you squeeze it in the diagram?
Yes, I do. And I don't have something on that. And um, typically you'll end up having something that looks like a cross between a flow chart and you know, a UI diagram and API docs and code, all kind of crammed into one place. And so I have used the little diamond shaped box that you might see in a flow chart to have you know, have a line coming in and say, you know, check, have I launched the app before? Go this path. If I haven't launched the app before, go through the onboarding. And yeah, that's a really good question. And often there's more than two paths. Often there's several, you know, 3-4 ways to go from a particular point in the flow. And so, you know, there's really no hard and fast rules to any of this. What you're trying to do is kind of develop a diagram that works best for you to capture the details of your particular problem. Because every single app we build is different. You know, every single problem we're trying to solve has its own unique challenges that, you know, I might never see in something I develop, but that may be, you know, the core to something you do.
And another question, what application was used to create this diagram?
Okay, yeah, so I used, it's called diagrams.net, and it's a plugin for Google Docs or Google Drive. And I think I found it just by searching the Google Apps, I forget what it's called, Google Apps library of drawing tools. And I found that this one, it's maybe not the prettiest, but it does the job of letting you draw all the kinds of lines that or at least that I need to do, and it has all the basic shapes, and so it's pretty simple. It's free, and there are better tools out there. And in my experience, one of the best diagramming tools I've ever used is Microsoft Visio, so which has been around forever. Um, it's not the best tool for sharing, but it's very easy to use and do things very quickly and have it look not completely ugly. Um, but yeah, let's go a couple more steps ahead, and then maybe we can talk more about a couple more diagramming tools. So anything else before I proceed?
Looks like Navadi has a follow-up question. I'm not sure what she means by this. Thanks for answering. So you mean create a reference to that flow chart? Yeah, and you can unmute yourself if you want to clarify that question. Or we can go back to it later.
Yeah, we can get back to it. That's fine. So in the beginning, I talked about my experience and kind of how some of this diagramming, came about for me, and why, why we needed this tool. And so as we used an interaction diagram in the team to start to represent all of these things that were in the code and the back end and the specs and design, it really did help improve communication between all the teams. And I found that the mobile and the back end teams got really tight. We worked really well together because we were uncovering a lot of kind of tricky, complicated interactions between the mobile and the web and the backend services. And the backend teams were really excited because usually people don't talk to them about the details of their APIs. And so we had a really good rapport there. I think the design team liked it because they got a little more insight into what we needed from them up front. And so it wasn't just that they're designing screen after screen. It's like, oh, well, we need to figure out how we're going to do a common, design system for waiting screens. And, now we have this reusable design component that has a button that has a spinner in it and whatnot. And so it really did improve the communication between the teams and helped us uncover a lot of stuff, especially as we use this in future projects, helped us discover things that we were missing ahead of time or before it got too late in the project. And that having used this on more than one project, a lot of the stress started to go away of capturing the little details that we knew were out there, but maybe we didn't know everything about it. We now had a tool to help us talk about these things and sort things out before they became problems. And so general suggestions, I think I've covered it a little bit, is use whatever drawing tools work best for your team. You have to be able to share them, and you need to be able to let other people comment and edit. That's really important to kind of bring everybody together and to be able to work as a team and share that load of keeping things up to date. And ask your questions on the diagram. That way everybody can see it when they look at it, and they can know what questions haven't been answered. Because there may be somebody on the team that really needs to get pestered, or they're super busy. Your project manager may be the person that goes and talks to everybody and says, hey, there's this outstanding question. You need to get this answered before you move on to new work. That helps foster that. And making sure you're explicit. don't make assumptions about how something behaves. Make sure it's written down. I was using color on my diagrams, which is really good. But you want to use shapes as well, and different shapes maybe to represent things that are modal versus full screen. Especially if you have somebody on your team that has color blindness, color deficiency. I've worked with someone who we went through an hour and a half long presentation, and everybody was talking about the things that were circled in red. And at the end of the presentation, he's like, you keep talking about these things that are in red, but I didn't see those. We're like, oh. So make sure that you use maybe more than one type of indicator if you're trying to show differences between modal views and standard views, or error alerts. And add as much detail as you need to capture everything. Don't be afraid that it doesn't look pretty. Our job as developers is not to make it look nice. Our job is to sweat the details and capture everything and build the product that we need to build. And so if it doesn't look great, that's okay. Focus on the details, make sure you get your questions answered. That's what's important. And I like to say this: if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. If somebody answers your question in Slack, that needs to get written down somewhere, whether it's in your spec or whether it's on your diagram or whether the designs change. If you get to the end of the project and somebody says, oh, well, we decided in that meeting that this should have been green and not blue, you can say, well, where is that documented? Well, we talked about it in that meeting. Well, I wasn't in the meeting. Why didn't you write it down? You don't want to get there. And so anytime you're using this document to make decisions, make sure it gets captured so that you don't get into that situation. And so, yeah, just like a picture's worth 1,000 words, that picture is worth 1,000 lines of rewritten code and a lot of heartache and, long hours. If you can use a tool to help you capture things succinctly and comprehensively and be able to communicate better, that makes us all happier in the end. And hopefully you aren't writing thousands and thousands of lines that you have to rework after the fact because you didn't talk about things. So questions. So I know one of the questions we're talking about different tools to use. I'm going to bring up the chat so I can actually see it and see what suggestions are out there. So I'm going to type in the chat maybe some of the ones that I know about. Diagrams.net, Lucid Chart is another. Let's see what else. The Paper app on iPad is one I've used. Trying to think of the other. MindNode, OmniGraph. Well, thank you. It was slipping my mind. MindNode is a mind mapping tool, but it has some really great diagrams. Let's see, others. Microsoft Visio for sure. I haven't used it in a while, so I don't know what sharing things they've added. Google Draw, is it still called Google Draw? That's a good one too. It's really a little more basic than Lucid Chart and some of the others, but it gets the job done in a pinch. Please don't use, if you can avoid it, Google Slides and uh, and basically any kind of presentation tool, because even though they have boxes and things like that, they end up being very hard to manage and to capture things at a really kind of information dense resolution. You run out of room and capability really quickly. So I know, any other suggestions that people have? I know I'll have to scroll back to see.
I know Angie had a question. If you scroll up a little bit.
What's your advice on getting buy-in from the design, product and design teams, especially if there's pushback? So in my experience, we built these diagrams on our own to help us kind of understand the complexity of what was going on. But as soon as we had kind of captured that first pass and started to see where there were questions and where there were things missing, we shared it. And what we got buy-in from the technical teams really quickly, because they were focused on that same kind of detail oriented level. And so from the technical team's point of view, everybody was on the same page at the same time. And we were doing web and Android and iOS that had to have all the same features, and we were all hitting the same endpoints. And so we wanted to be able to write our code in the same way and the same kind of follow the same processes of moving through the app. And so that was a no-brainer for the technical teams. The design teams, I think they appreciated the feedback and appreciated us kind of poking holes in their designs, although sometimes there's some resistance or something there. The product team was the hardest, I think, in my experience, to kind of get them on board, because maybe this is my impression, but that they wrote the specs and they thought everything was good and we're done, and why aren't you guys all going off and writing code? And I think the more momentum we got from other people on the whole team saying, hey, this is really good, we're answering these questions, whatever, the value of that became more apparent. And within the group I was working with, once that value really was apparent for most of the people on the team, were like, we started a new project and they're like, oh, hey, are you going to draw one of those diagrams for this? We're like, absolutely. And so that became a standard part of our process for larger efforts. So I think the pushback is maybe getting enough people on board to see the value, and then everybody else kind of comes along for the ride. And because there are a lot of free tools out there, a lot of times I've seen organizations that could push back because they don't want to buy something, they don't want to spend some more money on yet another tool, because there are so many free or very low cost drawing tools that get the job done. That usually kind of eliminates that hurdle, that you don't have to say, oh, well, we have to buy 10 seats of this thing in order to move forward. Most of the time, you might already have something, or you can use the free stuff that Google or somewhere else provides.
And I find, because we've worked on some of the same projects at our last company, Steve, that it gets really complicated when you have, the web team, front end web, and then the back end, and then you have the different mobile teams and so forth. That having a diagram that all the teams can look at and understand and follow, I think is very valuable. So yeah, thanks for sharing that with us. So Navati has a sore throat, which is why she can't speak, but we're gonna give this another shot if you don't mind humoring us. Okay, so we're talking about the retry logic on the diagram. And then the follow-up question was, can you create a reference to that flow chart in reference to adding logic to that retry logic? I'm not sure if I'm representing that question adequately.
Okay, so, yeah, and I see a threshold to be tried twice only, et cetera. Yeah. Yeah, let me actually get out of full screen mode here. And which means I have to move things around from this. Okay. And should have this diagram up. Okay. So one of the things that I'll do, and I realize this is really crowded, but let's just move some things around. And this is kind of what, oh, that's ugly. This is kind of what happens in some of the little working meetings that I've had in the past, is that instead of talking about it and going back later and editing things, you just edit right then and there. And that's a lot more useful. And, notice I'm not trying to be pretty, partly because of time, but partly because we want to capture the important things. And so let's say that our payment processor really doesn't like you hitting their endpoint with multiple retries for similar, similar payment information. Oh, I forgot or I got the wrong expiration date, or I got the wrong expiration date again, or I'm fishing for something, or maybe they rate limit it. Here's where you might say, okay, you might say something like this, where you're gonna look at how many retries that you're allowed, and if it's less than that, you'll go and submit the request again. But maybe that's only in the case of some unusual error. But what if you've got invalid information? And actually, if you have retried more than once, you might want to present some other error. Or you may want to change things around and say, you know what, if I get this error, I'm going to retry. And if that fails, then I'm going to come out and indicate an error to the user. So I'll silently retry before I tell the user there's a problem. And so being explicit, making sure that you capture as much of that relevant detail as possible in the diagram is important, because if you're working with the backend team, they need to see that, hey, you're going to be hitting us multiple times. Is that okay? We need to support that. And, maybe the product team is like, oh, we get this error, what are we going to do? Can't we just try again? Now your diagram answers that question. And so capturing things like this, one of the other things that I mentioned was, you have this onboarding, but what if you are coming into the app from start and you say, have we onboarded? And if the answer is no, you go here. And if the answer is yes, then let's say you have to sign in every time. So all of those sorts of things are good to capture here because it's capturing different things in the flow of your UI. And you have to write code for this. So it's not just you that's involved in the process, it's the product people and the design people are involved in that because, they're documenting this stuff. They're saying, hey, we need to do this. It's not just that you go through onboarding every time. They're making a conscious decision as to how the app's going to behave.
So Angie, I don't know how we're doing on time. Do we have time for any more last questions?
We are at 1:05, so we're a little past the hour, but we still have quite a few people on here.
All right. Any other comments, questions? By the way, really great talk, Steve. Thank you so much for doing that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and if you need to contact me, oops, I stopped sharing my screen. Hold on just a second. Yeah, if you do need to contact me, you can email me at my Atomic Robot email, steve@atomicrobot.com, or on social media, on Stack Overflow, on LinkedIn, pretty much everywhere I'm at Steve Coles. And if I'm not, if you search for my name on that service, you'll probably find me. So, so yeah, feel free to ping me, just about any way you wish.
And you're getting a lot of positive feedback on your talk,
Good.
Steve.
And if you're interested in how to validate US postal addresses, there's a link to the API there, etc. So it gets really complicated. All right, great. Well, thanks everybody. I just saw something about accessibility in the diagrams is important, and yeah, you're right. And today I believe is World Accessibility Day, or did I miss it by a day? So yeah, always keep that in mind in your apps and in your communication tools. Right.